Can you dub with a 101? With its drops, massive delays, beautiful round bottom and intensive production work, is it possible to produce an authentic dub sound on the MC-101 alone? You may think that with only 4 tracks, the MC-101 would run out of space quite quickly. However, what you have to bear in mind is that the original dub producers only had 4 tracks to work with themselves. And as long as you have the right tones and you can work with the faders and drop tracks in and out, you can get something which reproduces the bare bones. The track playing in the background came entirely from the MC-101, and I think it has that kind of authentic edge, although I can't claim to be a King Tubby or a scientist. In this track, I think it's the horns which really give you that authentic flavour, and I'm going to show you how to make those. In fact, the story of making the horns goes back maybe 10 years. Back then I used to use the Caustic app almost exclusively to produce music on. I had downloaded a few sound fonts to produce orchestral natural instrument style sounds. So when I wanted to produce an authentic sounding horn section, I already had some of the tools at my fingertip. I then thought about what a horn section actually was, and there you tend to think that you've got 3 parts. You've got a trombone which acts for the bottom end, you've got a trumpet which generally takes the top end, and then the mid-range is covered with numerous other instruments. The key, of course, is to how you blend those instruments together. And basically, each of the parts takes a different note in a triad, so you are playing a chord across 3 instruments. What's nice about this is that chords don't have to remain static, and you can swap which instruments play which notes of the triad. So for example, you might start with the trombone playing the root, and a trumpet playing the 5th. And then swap over so that you've got the trumpet playing the root and the trombone going to play the 5th. The chord remains the same, but the voicing or the flavour of it has changed. As I was saying, I had written this horn section for a track I made in Caustic, and I decided, looking at making dubs nowadays, that I would just take the whole of that horn line and then cut it up into separate pieces. And while I had Caustic open, I ripped off the bass line as well and took out some of the nice spring reverb hits and kicks. One of the nice things about having the horn section and the bass chopped up as samples was that I could use them on the same drum track. Although I couldn't ride the fader, I could mute and unmute the pads to drop the instruments in and out. And what's more, because on the MC-101 each pad can be given a different offset for how much the effects take for it, I could have the horn section with delay and the bass line completely dry. But we'll go back to the bass and the horns after we have a look at how the drums have been set up. One of the things that I like to do when writing drums on the MC-101 is to copy snares. So I will have 2 identical snare sounds, but one I will give a large amount of delay to. and then sometimes I will have a third snare which I will put reverb on. When I program up the pattern, I can double up the hits and have the dry snare and the delayed snare and the reverb snare, or in this case the spring reverb samples that I've got, all hitting on the same beat, and in reggae that tends to be the third beat of the bar. Then when I add some variation, you will occasionally get the delayed drum coming or the spring reverb hit. In my head, this gives the flavour of a dub technician at the controls, adding a little bit of delay or giving the reverb unit a crafty whack. And that is part of how I like dub to be. I also added some dub siren sounds in there, which were fired off at random in a very similar kind of way. And having programmed up a variation of the steppers beat, I moved on to the other elements, starting with the bass. The bass line was fairly straightforward. Having sliced up the separate notes, I laid them out on the bottom row of a drum pad set. And then set them all to exactly the same choke group. I could then build up a line bit by bit, starting with the root note on the first beat of the bar. In the original track I wrote, I had 8 different variations of the bass line, and I dropped them in almost randomly in order to have the flow and the variation and to keep things interesting in the track. With the MC-101, I could write a very full bass line and then add some randomisation so that notes would drop in and out. In this way, I would have the variation which kept the interest all the way through, with only really having to write a 2-bar loop. The horn section was slightly more complicated. The individual notes I laid across the top row of pads on the same drum track as the bass. Only on the 8th pad I had a completely different sound. Again, all of the pads were set to the same choke group, so that when one note played, it cut off another one. And this was why I had a different sound on the 8th pad. I basically set the volume to silence so that I could use it later for a little trick with the dynamics. And then I wrote the horn part. I played it in to start off with, and then went into the step mode to tidy it up and make sure hits were where I wanted them to be, so that the whole thing sounded quite smooth and quite nice. And I introduced variation in the same way as I did with the bass line, adding mute sections so that again the horns would be changing slightly all the way through the track. And this is where my silent 8th pad came in. Because I'm playing back samples with a set length, there's a limitation on working with the dynamics of the gate length. So what I could do was set up that silent pad on every 8th beat, and then set random variation on there so that it would fire off occasionally. And when it fired off, it would cut whatever note was playing short. in which case I would have a staccato layer that would be added at random to the horn part. And there I had it, the basic bare bones of a dub track. All I needed to do was add a skank line that I could drop in and out on one of the tracks, and a floaty wafty arpeggiator which would add a little bit of up-to-date digidub style vibe to the track. Hope you got something out of this. Like, subscribe, press the bell because I'm not making videos as regularly as I once was, and in the words of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, share and enjoy.